Buenos días. Good morning. It's an honor and a pleasure to introduce Professor Marman. There's not much to say because all of you know perfectly who is him and what is he has been doing for the last years. I think since we are a little bit late, we can start with the conference straight away, if you don't mind. So, this lecture, non-accidental relations in early medieval Latin philosophy. It's a lecture you will receive. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much indeed, and I'm most grateful to the organisers for having invited me. Yes, first of all, is that all right? You're all hearing me? And I hope that you have handouts which might be useful. The handouts nevertheless contain a number of typos, which I hope you'll forgive me. There's a standard account of relations in medieval philosophy, which is the basis for most work on the area in the Anglophone tradition. It's presented in its clearest form in Geoffrey Brewer's article on the topic in the authoritative Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. But its main features are found already in the earliest survey of the field by a historian of philosophy with an analytic training. That's to say, Julius Weinberg's 1965 essay on the history of relation. The standard account also informs Henninger's important monograph on relations, medieval theories, 1250 to 1325, which was written in 1989. And it shapes even the writing of the occasional historians who look for exceptions to it. Although its proponents may take a brief look at Augustine, Boethius, and even Eriugena, and a glance at Arabic writers, the standard account is firmly based on the work of university theologians and the occasional arts master in the period that Henninger identifies explicitly in his subtitle, the later 13th and the beginning of the 14th century. The standard account makes two main claims. The first of them rests on a contrast with the usual way of treating relations in contemporary analytic philosophy, where their logical form is taken to provide the key to their ontological structure. Whereas a non-relational property can be represented by a function with one place, such as x is white, a relation such as x is the sum of y requires a function with two or more places, that is to say, a polyadic function. Contemporary philosophers are fond of talking about relations themselves as polyadic properties. And although this is really no more than a metaphor, I shall follow them and use it, since it at least makes clear the idea that a relation doesn't belong individually to any one of the things related, but to them all. Now, according to the standard account, medieval thinkers, by contrast, held relations to be one place or monadic properties, even if they recognized polyadic relational expressions. They did so because they based themselves on Aristotle. Not though on anything Aristotle actually says about relations, and in fact, Aristotle usually discusses relatives rather than relations, but rather because they were basing themselves on the basic metaphysical framework set out in Aristotle's categories. Relation is listed there as one of the categories of accident. Aristotelian accidents, however, cannot belong to more than one subject, at least certainly not at the same time. If relations are accidents, they must therefore be monadic. If I'm 6 foot tall and you're 5 foot, then there's an accident of relation inhering in me by which I'm taller than you, and a separate accident of relation inhering in you, by which you're shorter than I, on this standard account. Now, the second claim that the standard account makes is that up to the time of Occam, medieval philosophers in the Latin tradition were realists about relations. As Brewer puts it, with only slight qualification, and I quote, prior to the 14th century, it is difficult to identify any unambiguous representatives of anti-realism, at least in the Latin West. End of quote. Brewer puts it in this negative way, perhaps because it's also generally accepted that this realism was in many cases tempered. Every relational accident was considered to be founded on a non-relational accident. So, for instance, the non-relational accident in the category of quantity, of being 6 foot tall, founds my relational accident of being taller than you. For some 13th and early 14th century thinkers, the distinction between the relational accident and its foundation was not that between one thing and another thing. These theorists are still realists, because relations are real features of the world, not just ways of perceiving or talking about it, but, as Brewer puts it, reductive realists. Now, I began, when I was making these remarks, by confining their scope to the Anglophone analytic tradition. But in fact, this standard account is also followed in its broad lines by most scholars working in other traditions. They don't make the comparison with contemporary views of relations or use the terminology of monadic and polyadic properties, but there's the same consensus that before Occam, medieval philosophers were realists about relations which were regarded as Aristotelian accidents, each belonging to a different subject. And there is the same concentration on later 13th and early 14th century writers. I want to argue this morning that the standard account is wrong. Wrong, not in the account it gives of the writers on whom it concentrates, but in the overall view it provides of how medieval thinkers understood relations. And what I'm going to go on to say doesn't, I'm afraid, correspond to my title, nor to the abstract which was distributed in advance of the conference. Rather, it's something which I found as I set about my original inquiry, and because it's more interesting, I decided to focus on it. And so you should understand that what I'm doing now is giving you a report, if you like, of work in progress of the beginning of a new project, rather than a finished presentation. So let me explain how I, so to speak, stumbled on this idea. I proposed the original title of this paper because I thought more attention should be paid to the fact that most medieval Christian thinkers developed their ideas about relations, especially in connection with the Trinity. Of course, historians recognize theological considerations as a background to the discussion. And indeed, they usually suggest that one reason why medieval theories about relations before often were realist is that since the Trinity entails there being relations in God, and these relations must be real, it seems reasonable to suppose that there are other real relations. As Suarez, looking back on the whole medieval tradition, put it, this is handout number 1, the concept of relation as such is not a fiction, but is something real, since in God it's something real. But the historians have usually stopped here, overlooking the fact that, with regard to the central object of their concern, God, none of the medieval thinkers accepted the standard model of relations as Aristotelian accidents. So what I hoped originally was to correct this oversight, and I decided that I'd do so by concentrating on the Latin tradition up until 1200, which is neglected in most discussions. But as I started to look at these thinkers, it quickly became apparent that, in fact, in most cases, their entire approach to relations is very different from that of their 13th century successors. The mainstream of their thinking about the area was even more clearly linked to a discussion of the Trinity, but, following Boethius, as I shall explain, rather than taking the reality of relations in God as a reason for thinking that there are real relations in other things too, they used the extrinsic nature of relative predications as a way of explaining how the three divine persons, conceived as relations, are one God. And, although they propose or imply a variety of theories, most of them steer clear of the monadic, real relational accidents of the standard account. And so what I'm going to do in the rest of this lecture is to run through some of this rich early medieval material in chronological order. And you have a selection of it in your handout. It wasn't until the 11th century that Boethius's translation of Aristotle's own categories was widely studied. And of course, not until the 13th century that his remarks on relation in metaphysics were available. So two fundamental texts for early medieval accounts of relatives and relations were both Augustinian, though I should say neither of them was the central text, and we'll come to what the central text was in a few moments. And first of these Augustinian texts is by Augustine at Book 5 of his De Trinitate. There he considers how Aristotle's 10 categories can be predicated of God. And unlike Aristotelian categories, he makes a sharp distinction between substance, which can be truly predicated of God, and the 9 other categories of accidents. In fact, he begins by suggesting that none of these other categories applies to God, because God is good without quality, great without quantity, and so on. But later, he finds that there is a way of predicating some properties of God literally, rather than through metaphor or simile. And he does this by explaining that when we say that God is good or great, we mean that God is goodness or greatness itself. So, in this case, we're not predicating accidents, we are talking about the substance of God. Now, as for relatives, and if you look at 3 on handout, Augustine says that they too can be predicated literally of the persons of the Trinity. As when we talk of the Father and the Son, or we say that the Son, for instance, is begotten. These predications, Augustine says, are not made accidentally, because whatever is accidental is changeable, whereas the Father is unchangeably the unbegotten Father of the Son, and so on. But neither are these predications made substantially, because the Father, for instance, is not said to be father from himself, but in relation to another, because of the fact that he has a son. Such predications are, according to Augustine, relative, but not accidental, whereas in creatures, relative predications are a type of accidental ones. And so I've tried to find out 4 to summarize the position there. The other important Augustinian text isn't by Augustine at all, but it's a work which everybody in the Middle Ages thought was by Augustine. That's to say, the so-called Categoriae Decem, the Latin paraphrase commentary of Aristotle's categories from the Circle of the Mysteries, which from the time of Alcuin onwards was attributed to Augustine. And the interesting thing here is the division which is made of the different categories. So you could say Aristotle, in his categories, doesn't make a division, and just has the 10 categories, but they're all on the same level. Augustine himself makes a sharp division between substance and the others, though it then becomes a bit less sharp. In the Categoriae Decem, there's a distinction between the first of the categories, and the Greek name is kept, so we talk about ousia rather than substance. And then certain categories which are outside ousia, certain categories which are inside ousia, and certain categories which are both inside and outside ousia. And relation, in fact, comes out as one of the categories both inside and outside ousia. But I want to hurry on to what I say is the absolutely central text for early medieval discussion of relation. More central than either of these two Augustinian texts, and actually more central than Aristotle, even than Aristotle's categories, and that's to say the first of Boethius' Opus Philosophica, his De Trinitate. Because here one has a very detailed discussion of relations, and the De Trinitate and the other Opus Philosophica of Boethius were an important textbook. They were studied as a textbook, and they were extensively glossed in a way that didn't happen, for instance, to Augustine's De Trinitate. And Boethius' view about relations is developed at such length because it's absolutely central to the theological aim of his work, which is to establish that the distinction between the persons of the Trinity is not such as to compromise the unity of God's essence. In number 7 on the handout, I've given you Boethius' name, Boethius' division, which you'll see is different again. Boethius distinguishes between substance, quality, and quantity on the one hand, and the other categories, including relation, on the other. Substance, quality, and quantity are supposed to tell us something about what the thing concerned actually is, whereas all the other categories are extrinsic. Just let me read numbers 8 and 9 on the handout, which are extracts from the Trinitate. Now, is it clear what is the distinction between predications? Asked Boethius. There are some which, as it were, show the thing, others which show, as it were, the circumstances of the thing, in that there are those which are so predicated that they show a thing to be something, and those which do not show the thing to be something, but rather in some way attach something extrinsic to it. Therefore, those which show that something exists are called predications according to the thing. When they say the things which are subject to accidents, they're called accidents according to the thing. But when it is applied to God, who is not a subject, it is called predication according to the substance of the thing. And extract 9. So here he's giving a clue about the nature of all these 7 extrinsic attributes in talking about the category of aware. For a man is not said to be informed in the same way as he's said to be white or tall, nor as if he were, so to speak, surrounded and determined by some property by which he could be designated according to himself. But he is shown through this predication only insofar as it is something indicated by other things. And relatives themselves are an especially striking case of this sort of generically relative predication. Number 10 on the handout. For these relatives seem most of all not to make a predication secundum se, since they are clearly seen to obtain from the coming of something else. relative predication as a whole does not consist in being something which exists, but rather obtains in some way in that it is in comparison, and not always with something itself, with something different from itself, but sometimes with the same thing. Now, here, Boethius is just speaking about types of predication. What ontological status does he give to the relations themselves? There's a very suggestive passage about this in 11 on the handout, where Boethius is contrasting the way in which a white thing ceases to be a white thing when whiteness is removed from it, and the way a master ceases to be a master if his slave is removed. And he says, but in the case of the master, if you remove the slave, the word by which he is called master disappears. But the slave is not an accident of the master, as the whiteness is of the white thing. Rather, the accident is a certain power by which the slave is coerced. And since this power disappears when the slave is removed, it's clear that it's not an accident per se of the master, but extrinsically, in a certain way, through the coming of slaves. And I think we can interpret this comment in two ways. Either the accident described as a certain power by which the slave is coerced is not itself considered to be relational. This non-relational accident is all that there is in reality at the basis of the relation, which is itself thought of as a purely linguistic phenomenon. Because of the non-relational accident of power, the man can be called a master. Or, second interpretation, this power is thought of as a relation, so a relation between the master and one or more slaves. But precisely because it depends on something outside the man concerned, it is not his accident in the full sense of the word. And it's this second interpretation which, given Boethius's theological aims, seems to me the more plausible. And another indication of Boethius's attitude here to the ontology of relations is that for an example of relation in general, he chooses the following case of relation, that is, where you're standing on my left, and then because you move, though I do nothing, my relation to you is changed, and you're standing on my right. So I'm now going to move from what people often consider as late antiquity to the Middle Ages proper, though I don't really accept that distinction. I'm going to start very briefly, too briefly, with a few words about relation in Eriugena, which apparently was being discussed yesterday morning when, alas, I was only on my way here. Right. And obviously my computer is upset by Eriugena's general sort of strangeness, because, as I say, we would have to take a bit of a parenthesis, but it's too interesting to miss out. So, Eriugena is writing in the mid-9th century. He knows the categories through the Categoria Decan. He also knows Boethius's De Trinitate, but in a way quite characteristic of him, he doesn't follow them. And he makes all sorts of divisions of the categories, which seem to be of his own invention. The most interesting of these divisions, with regard to relation, comes when he's considering which categories fall under motus, motion, and which under status, being still. And he argues that ousia, quantity, situs, posture, that is, and locus, place, are at rest, and all the others are in motion. And then the question is posed, well, surely relation and having, these are the two most obviously relational categories, are at rest. Because isn't a having, a habitus, a fixed disposition? And isn't the relation of a father to a son, something which doesn't change? And no, Eriugena responds, because he says, a habitus is striving towards perfection but never getting there. And as for relation, and this is handout 12, he says, I don't know why you hesitate about relation when you see that it cannot be in one and the same thing, for it always seems to be in two things. Now, who can doubt that the appetite of two things towards each other comes to be by a certain motion? So here, Eriugena is clearly thinking about relations as the real properties, but he has a very clear idea of them as what we would now call polyadic properties. He says relation is in two things which move towards each other because of it. I now move back more to the mainstream of early medieval thought about this, looking at the early medieval glosses on Boethius's De Trinitate. And they are part of the mainstream, though they may well have been influenced by Eriugena, and a writer such as Heinrich of Auxerre, who himself was influenced by Eriugena, may have been at their origin. Now, there are enormous textual complications about these glosses, and I could spend a whole lecture talking about them, but so as to stick to our main subject, I'm just going to pretend that the text edited over a century ago by Rand is adequate, and quote from that. And the glossator makes his approach clear in the passage given to you as 13 on the handout, where and this is a gloss on that passage in De Trinitate about the master and the slave. The glossator says, the word alone perishes, but not the substance, because the category ad alipid, relation, is not predicated concerning substance, but concerning words. Because one relies on the other, and they are said in some way to be and to be converted with each other, and when one word perishes, the other perishes too. As master is not said unless there is a slave over whom is master, nor slave unless there's a master. So as you can see here, the glossator takes the first, I think perhaps less plausible, of the interpretations of Boethius I suggested, according to which relations are purely a matter of language. And so we move on, and this is necessarily a very quick whistle-stop tour. We move on to Anselm. And I don't need to say much about this because in the article which I give you details of in handout 14 by Christoph Erisman, there's a section which begins, which is entitled Anselm, Occam's Ally. And the point is that in chapter 25 of Anselm's Monologion, with Boethius's De Trinitate very much in mind, Anselm explains that relations, at least some relations, do not make any change in the substances they affect. And he suggests that they're not even properly called accidents. Occam noticed this, and Occam, of course, somebody who is trying very definitely to put forward a non-realist, anti-realist account of relations, so turning against the 13th century, and early 14th century standard account. Occam sees him as an ally, and he says, handout 14, Anselm teaches how we should accept relation as an accident. For it's not called an accident because it's a form which really informs the substance of which it is said, like likeness, but because it's something predicable of something contingently which can be successively affirmed and denied, because that of which it is said or something else changes. For example, equality in likeness, master, creator, etc. Now, what I've been arguing is that Anselm's view is not something strange. And Anselm did think about the categories in his own way, and could take up unusual positions. But in treating relations in this way, he's actually at one with most other writers of this period and before. However, in one area, in Anselm's lifetime, toward the end of his lifetime, there comes about an important change. And this comes about when logicians start carefully to read the categories in Boethius's exact translation and start to write commentaries on it. And we have the first commentaries from this from around about the turn of the 12th century. And suddenly we find something which is really like a somewhat crude and extreme version of what I call the standard account, which one finds in the 13th century text. That's to say, they start to consider relations as monadic accidents of the same ontological standing as non-relational accidents, i.e. genuine items in the inventory of objects that make up the world. And it would be interesting to know where they get this from. There's an important article by Christopher Martin, which I give you in number 15 of the handout, which is called, and it's important to know the name, The Invention of Relations. Because Martin points out that if you look at Aristotle's categories and the discussion of relation there, or even at Boethius's discussion of that in his commentary, in general, and I think he perhaps exaggerates this slightly so far as Boethius is concerned, but in general, we have a discussion not of relations, but of relatives. It seems to be about this time, so we're talking about Abelard and his logical works, and perhaps his sort of slightly older contemporary William of Champeau. It seems to be about this time that people actually start thinking about relations and get this notion of a relation as a real monadic accident. And what Abelard himself considers is that, supposing, indeed as true, I am Maximus's father, I then have a relational accident of paternity. And Maximus has a corresponding relational accident of sonship. And Abelard holds that supposing I were to have more than one son, then I would need to have separate particular accidents of paternity. So one for Maximus, one for Magnus, one for Minimus, and so on. And that position was disputed at the time. So you find another commentary, the sort of standard commentary on the categories, which is found in a few manuscripts of the time, arguing, not disputing the idea that relations are real monadic accidents, but saying that in this case I would just need the one accident of paternity to do for however many children I have. So what I'm saying is that from the early 12th century, among people actually commenting on Aristotle's logic, there seems to grow up this predecessor, this crude version of the standard account, which you hadn't had before in early medieval writers. And there would need to be more work done on the various and unpublished anonymous 12th century commentaries on the categories to bear this out. But from most of the ones I've looked at, it seems to be the case that there may be disputes, but basically they're treating it in this way. So that, if you like, is an exception to the general view I want to put forward. But it's quite a limited exception because, well, first of all, it's questionable even whether Abelard himself, who might have been the originator of this way of talking about things, sticks to it. And well, here again one enters quite difficult matters of interpretation. But I've argued in detail, and I've given you a reference to my book on Abelard in 4 dimensions, that if you look at a work which Abelard wrote a bit later than his logical commentary, that is to say his Theologia Christiana, he denies that relational accidents are real things. And he denies that not just about relational accidents in God, but also in creatures. And this is backed up by a paragraph, not written by Abelard, but purporting to describe the view of Abelard and his followers, in an important manuscript in Avranches, which also contains Abelard's De Intellectibus, which we can be pretty sure is genuine. And according to this note, Abelard and his followers reject the reality of accidents in many categories, including that of relation. It also seems that this view might be followed in the one anonymous 12th century commentary on the categories, which seems to have been a work of the nominalists, that's to say Abelard's followers, in an Oxford Dorville manuscript. The details of all that are in the handout. But I suppose more important in showing how this approach taken in commenting on the categories is exceptional, and the more general earlier medieval approach, which I've already sketched out, continues right through the 12th century, are the 12th century commentaries on De Trinitate. There are quite a few of them. If you open the book which purports to give you the works of Thierry of Chartres, edited by Herring, you'll find as many as 4. I myself doubt that these are works by the same author, and it's not clear to me that any of them are by Thierry of Chartres, but they are certainly later 12th century commentaries on Boethius Opus Sacra, including De Trinitate. And there's another more firmly attributed later 12th century commentary by Ramon Llull of Arras. All of these bear out more or less the view that you find in Boethius' own work, the view which avoids making of relations real monadic accidents. But I want to concentrate on the most interesting and most important of the 12th century commentaries on the Opuscula Sacra, the one by Gilbert of Poitiers, which was finished in the 1140s. I try in number 17 on the handout to give you a very quick sketch of Gilbert's basic ontology, which you need in order to understand his position. So Gilbert makes this central distinction between concrete wholes, or what he calls an id quod est, that which is, or a subsistent thing, and then the id quo est, by which a concrete whole is what it is. So, for example, Socrates is rational by his particular quo est of rationality, and he's white by his particular quo est of whiteness. Now, note there that he's just talking about the substantial form, rationality, and then accidents in the categories of quality and quantity, not the other ones. Because, like Boethius, he considers that the other accidents, including relation, and indeed especially relation, are all extrinsic. And in fact, you get a very good brief description of Gilbert's point of view in an unexpected place, in Aquinas, where Aquinas is saying why he thinks Gilbert went wrong. And he says, I put this on handout 18, I'm not going to go through it all, but Aquinas says that according to Gilbert, relations are auxiliary or attached from the outside. So, whereas Gilbert thinks that substance, quantity and quality make something what it is, the remaining 7 don't. Again, if you look at handout 19, 20, and 21, you'll see this. A thing has to be something through its substance, quality, and if it's corporeal, its quantity. And then the other 7 categories, including relation, can be applied to it. So, Gilbert can say, and this is 22 on the handout, relative predication in its entirety consists not in that which is to be, because it does not make anything be something, but rather it consists only in that which is to add itself to something else in the comparison of one thing to another. Now, in his commentary, not on the De Trinitate, but on the 5th of the Opuscula Sacra, the Contra Tica et Nestorium, Gilbert adds an important detail and also summarizes his view. This is 23 on the handout. He says, for the nature of a subsistent is that by which the subsistent thing is something. They indeed are the substantial forms and the intervals of measure. But the other things which are said of it by nature are called its various status, because it is set up to be this way one moment and otherwise at another moment, whilst keeping the measures and qualities, and most of all the subsistentia, the substantial forms, by which it is something. Those of you who are interested in Abelard and his account of universals will have picked up this word status, because for Abelard this is a very important notion. Abelard will say, human beings don't come together